Hey, BG.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Is there an echo?
I've got no echo coming from you.
Ah, good. Okay, because I'm going to use my speakers and mic rather than headphones, so hopefully that doesn't create an echo. If it does, I'll switch to headphones, but
Yeah, cool.
we'll see how it goes. And I am recording this. My recording software is kind of iffy, so if you might want to record this yourself if you have a way to do that, but if not, it should be fine. It's just every now and then it does weird things, like it just crashes, so.
Yeah, I would only have a way of recording one side of the conversation.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like if you turn on Audacity and point it to your soundboard or whatever, whatever it's called, the
Yeah.
mixer. Yeah, it's funny that you can't record all the audio in your computer at once, but oh well.
Yeah, I've never looked at setting this stuff up. You need a special program or something for it?
Well, for Skype, I use a program, that plugs into Skype because Skype has like this plug-in ability, and it records it as two tracks, which is kind of handy because often the volume is different.
Yeah.
So that allows you to, adjust the volume of one track versus the other to make them match. But it has this unfortunate drawback of crashing every now and then.
Yeah, okay.
So we're going to talk about the Revolutionary Phenotype by JF Gariepy. And by the way, there's some noise on your end. I don't know if that's your mic.
Yeah, I've realized that there's, like, my keyboard is the loudest thing in the world, and so I'm trying to move everything away from my microphone. Okay, that should be a little bit better.
Okay, no worries. Anyway, we're going to talk about the Revolutionary Phenotype by JF Gariepy. And I haven't read it. You have. And you're a proponent of his ideas. And so I think I'm going to let you present the ideas, and I'm going to be basically a critic.
Yeah.
Or a skeptic or whatever. I'm going to take a critical approach to this. I'm not going to be like, antagonistic or whatever, but I'll just be upfront. I think it's wrong, but I haven't read it, and I haven't even read through all of your slideshow. So, maybe I'm wrong. Like maybe I'm missing something or whatever. So I'm not completely closed-minded coming into this, but I'm saying that my superficial interpretation of it is that it's wrong. So that's my position, and you're taking it's a revolutionary new idea position. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's a modifier for Richard Dawkins' idea of replicators, where they're entities that tend to replicate, and so they tend to accrue mutations in whatever genetic media that they're replicating, and so they tend to be more fit. And saying that definition is a valid definition in certain contexts. However, there are some contexts where that's an insufficient definition to define the replicator.
That's not really Dawkins' definition. That's more of a general evolutionary theory definition.
Yeah, I say it's Dawkins' idea because it's like Dawkins has a very definite idea about what a replicator is, and everyone knows the Dawkins definition of a replicator. So. And in fact, I think he wasn't the guy to come up with it. There was some mathematician who came up with that idea of replicators before him.
Yeah, maybe von Neumann.
I think that's the guy.
Well, anyway. Well, so what we can do is go through, if you want, I just assume that might be the easiest way to do this, is go through the slideshow that you made, or, go through the ideas in that order. Maybe not go into everything, because it was pretty long, but maybe just try to hit on the critical points, and I'll let you do most of the talking, and then I'll, respond.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Where is my copy of the damn presentation?
I put you on the spot already.
Debunked. I think I've left it inside. I'll be back in about 30 seconds. I've got it all on my pocket USB for mobile presentation of extremely autistic scientific theories.
Okay. Are you sitting outside on your porch or something? And
I live in a shed surrounded by very large spiders in Australia.
you live in a shed in Australia. That's a good. There's a story behind that, I'm sure.
No, it's just that we have lots of sheds in our house, and it's sort of just easier to go to one of the sheds to be isolated.
Oh, I see. So you can do this sort of thing without people listening and feeling awkward about it and stuff like that.
Yeah, but the audio quality in this room is terrible. So the walls are made of corrugated iron, and so they're pretty good for stopping echoes because it's all wavy. But the problem is that it's a shed, not a house, and so you can hear every car that drives past.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, it shouldn't be too bad.
Yeah, so this is an intro to my presentation, which is an intro to the book by JF Gariepy. I'm going to say his name wrong every time. I can't pronounce French things. But anyway, so his book is a self-described minor addendum to the theory of evolution as summarized by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. And it is proposing a new modified definition for a replicator, which includes the qualifier that a replicator entity should be something that makes copies of itself, and that if an entity isn't directing its self-copying, it can't be selfish in the evolutionary way. So, for instance, a car. Well, in my presentation, I use, by way of example, a car as an example of an entity that is being copied, but it's not directing its own self-copying. And I argue that the important aspect of the car that makes it not a replicator is that, this kind of supposed replicator, a car, sorry, let me say that again, because the true replicator, the DNA, has full access to rewriting of the car, of the fooled replicator. And so any evolutionary path that the car may potentially go down that leads to an imposition against the fitness of the DNA may be met by a counter-evolutionary response in the DNA, where the DNA modifies the way it copies the full replicator by its own accumulated mutations until the full replicator, which is the car, has its interests, its potential evolutionary interests, directed towards the copying of the DNA, whereas the car can't do this to the DNA. And so we can say that the DNA is the replicator and the car is the full. It is a kind of replicator in that it copies itself. There are certainly lots of copies of certain cars existing in the universe, and they're all copied with a degree of error. But they will always be copied in a way that serves the interest of the DNA, the thing that this phenotype, the car, is rooted in. And so the evolution of these entities will be determined by the DNA's selfish evolutionary interest rather than the full replicator interest.
But when you say, okay, can I jump in for a sec?
Yep,
so
yep.
When you say the DNA's selfish evolutionary interest, that's a very vague statement, first of all.
Yeah.
Because there is no such thing as the DNA, right? DNA is just deoxyribonucleic acid, right? It's just a kind of molecule. And what's being replicated is, yeah, sure, that kind of molecule, but what's being replicated is the information that's in that molecule, right? So it's not like it's not like DNA has an evolutionary interest or evolves or anything like that. It's that specific forms evolve, right? So like the human form evolves, and the wolf form and the sheep form and so on. they all evolve by the same process of evolution, right? They all have DNA in them, but they have different, there's different information in the DNA, and there's different information in the system, that, the complete system of those forms, which goes beyond DNA.
Yeah.
So when you say the DNA's evolutionary interest, that doesn't really mean anything. You could talk about the evolutionary interest of some piece of information, like a gene, which is just to exist, or you could talk about the evolutionary interest of an organism, which is to perpetuate or to copy its DNA, or just to reproduce, in other words, right? Reproductive fitness is the evolutionary interest of an organism, but that interest is created by evolution. It's manifest in the form because the form evolved by that process, right? By the process of natural selection, that the instances of the form that were better at reproducing, their information became, that information increased in the world. And the ones that were not as good at doing that, their information disappeared or was, reduced in frequency. So to say something like it's in the DNA's interest, I don't know what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So I should explain further. So when I say the DNA, I'm using that as a broad. So it's not exactly accurate. Obviously, the free-floating nucleotides that don't incorporate themselves and are not incorporated into any sort of genome or larger informational structure are not going to be replicators. It's only a certain kind of DNA in certain circumstances that are replicators. And so you could say that these DNA molecules in certain structures are genes. So let's go with that for now. So it's the genes that have it's the DNA that is in genes that direct their self-copying that are the selfish evolving replicator.
Well, that's not really true by your definition, unless I'm not understanding it. DNA doesn't copy itself, right? It's just it's a stable way to store information. You need proteins to copy DNA. You need a whole system, right? And not just proteins. You need you need the whole cell, right? And with humans, you don't just need the whole cell. You need the whole body, and you need a society. Like, for example, human DNA can't replicate without fire. And there might come a day when human DNA can't replicate without cars, because we just have I wouldn't say we'll ever get to that point, but my point is that what replicates is the information, and it's not just in the DNA, it's in the entire system. And the DNA doesn't copy itself. It is copied by a system it's the system that copies, or that generates new copies or new organisms that are similar to the original organism. To say that DNA copies itself is just very misleading.
Yeah, so it's the DNA copies itself in certain circumstances. So if you throw DNA into the vacuum of space, it won't copy itself. But in at least some certain circumstances, DNA does have the information that directs its self-copying. And specifically, it's the DNA that makes up all of the polymerase genes and the genes related to the printing of DNA sequences, including DNA repair proteins.
Well, but that's a very narrow view of it, right? Like, you could say, the only gene that really replicates then is the gene for cutting DNA. I can't remember what it's called, the one that splits it down the middle, and then the proteins, the genes that code for the enzymes that then synthesize it.
Yeah, so I think it's helicase that splits it.
Yeah, I can't remember. I have a biochemistry book over here, but we'll just go with there are some enzymes that do this job, and they have genes associated with them. So you could say the very minimal thing is that the DNA, the genes for those enzymes, plus the enzymes plus, but that's not correct, because those enzymes don't exist outside the environment of the cell, right? So if you just had that system, it wouldn't work, because you wouldn't have the energy to do the replication.
Yeah, so I'm not. So those components of the genome, for instance, all the genes that are not directing the reprinting of copies of the genome, they are evolving, but they're not evolving in a selfish manner. So they're not. All of these genes don't possess evolutionary selfishness.
But define that. What does that mean then? What is evolutionary selfishness in this theory?
It's that they evolve towards securing a line of descent. I think I might have the wording wrong here.
But they do, because, like, let's say I have a gene for, some enzyme that's in the citric acid cycle, but it has nothing to do with copying DNA, but it's essential to the citric acid cycle. So without that, none of my cells could live, right? They wouldn't have an energy metabolism. So let's say there's an enzyme that's critical to the energy metabolism of a cell. Well, without that enzyme, there ain't no copying of anything. So how is that not just as essential as the enzymes that split the DNA or whatever, or do the copying? So
great examples of this essentiality are things like... Sorry, did you hear that beep?
I didn't. It might just be that I muted my microphone. Maybe you heard a beep when I did that. I don't know.
No, I've got someone sending messages to me on my end.
Oh, okay. Don't worry about it. I don't.
Okay. So the great examples of a sort of essentiality to the reproduction of some organism are things like genes for ribosomes or genes for ATP synthase, which, like, organisms are very obviously going to die in the absence of. But you could hypothesize that there would be some future scenario where cars were essential to the survival of humans. Perhaps Mad Max Fury Road and that universe. If you couldn't secure a car, then you would die. But regardless, the car or the ribosome or ATP synthase would not be able to... any mutations in these genes that lead to a loss of fitness of the replicase would eventually be weeded out, because the replicase is the thing that all of these other genes and all of these other things that aren't the replicase are dependent upon.
Yeah, but they're all tied. They're all interdependent. There's no difference there. You said any mutation that led to a loss of fitness in the replicase gene or whatever. Sure, but the only way you could have a loss of fitness in the replicase gene because of an enzyme in the citric acid cycle is because the enzyme was inefficient at metabolism or prevented it, in which case none of them replicate. See, it's a system that replicates. It's not just the replicase gene. The replicase gene can't replicate. You need the whole system. And with a complex life form like a human being, it's not even just the biology of a human that has to replicate as a system. Without culture, we can't exist, right? You take a human being with no knowledge, throw them out in nature, they just die. The hypothetical scenario in which cars are essential to human existence and we can create them would be a situation in which the system of humans and cars is the thing that perpetuates, and in a sense, at least their reproduction is linked, right? They now are symbiotically linked, just like algae and fungus and a lichen. Neither can exist without the other.
Yeah, so I'm not making an argument about what is essential, because there's an incredible amount of things that are essential for example, a human life to exist. You need oxygen. It's essential. And so there are all these plants on Earth that are essential for human lives and human reproduction. I'm making an argument for what is selfish. And so...
I understand that, but I'm saying that argument doesn't make sense, because like in the example I just gave, like let's just keep it to the enzymes. They either all work together to reproduce, or they don't. If any one of them doesn't work, the whole thing doesn't work. They all have to work, and they all reproduce as a system.
So I summarize the argument with the sentence that every gene or every sequence of DNA has an evolutionary interest in its own reproduction and that of DNA replicase. And so you can understand that all of these genes copy themselves in a way that is favorable to the copying of DNA replicase, because without the DNA replicase, there's no copies of all of these essential genes.
Well, yeah, but that's only because they have to copy together. They're not selected to make the replicase copy. They're selected to make the whole system copy, because that's the only way they can copy, right? So yeah, but you can just turn it around and say the replicase gene can only be selected to help the metabolism gene get into the future, because without the metabolism gene, the replicase gene doesn't exist. Those two things are inextricably linked. So you can't say one is selfish and the other isn't. Now, I don't even think the concept of selfishness makes sense for genes, really. It's very metaphorical. It makes more sense for organisms because their form was selected to do something. You could say the form of a gene is selected to perpetuate, not really to... I mean, it can only perpetuate by replicating to another molecule. But I don't know. Like yes, I think you can call genes selfish, but it is the point of that metaphor was that genes can be selected to, to just replicate themselves at the expense of other genes in the genome, or, that selfishness goes even deeper than the individual. But, anyway, but I think the distinction you're making doesn't make sense biologically, because you can't say that I wish I had a name for the gene for some enzyme. I should have thought of one in advance. I don't know, the enzyme that splits glucose into pyruvate or whatever. That gene, yes, it can only propagate if the replicase gene also propagates. But the opposite is also true. The replicase gene can only propagate if that gene propagates. Those two genes cannot exist, they cannot replicate independently. So to say that one of them is serving the interest of the other or whatever, to me, just does not make sense.
So there is a path towards the abolition of pyruvate synthase from organisms. So pyruvate synthase is actually the last step in glycolysis, which makes it a bad example for me, because I can't just then point to anaerobic bacteria as being organisms that don't rely on the citric acid cycle in order to reproduce, and say that there is a spectrum between having a citric acid cycle and not having a citric acid cycle.
Well, sure. I mean, you could say that there are life forms that don't require that enzyme and they have the DNA replicase gene in them. But if you're looking at a molecule in a certain organism, if you're looking at the replicase gene in a human, then that specific molecule will only copy itself into another, into the future through human reproduction, which is going to depend on, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of other genes and information that's not stored in genes that has to be propagated as well. So it goes back to that point, like the DNA is a misleading term, right? The DNA didn't evolve as a type of molecule. It's the information that's contained in DNA strands that has evolved, and it's gone down many branching paths, and down those branching paths, each of those branching paths is a system of genes that replicates as a unit, really, with maybe some genes that are not essential, like whether you have blue eyes or brown eyes, doesn't really matter. But a lot of the genes are essential, and you can't have that branch it cannot extend if you took out one of those genes, right? So again, I'm just saying that this notion seems like a misplaced metaphor.
So I think we need some way of resolving this distinction between evolutionary selfishness and, I guess, essentiality. So I think the difference is that I'm saying that all these things that the replicator accrues around it, like sperm and eggs, like a womb, and like a society, these are all things that accrue around a replicator directing itself copying. So the replicator, in this case, the replicase, has interest to, has a selfish evolutionary interest to cultivate other stuff around it, including all the other genes, including the egg, and then in the case of humans, their societies.
Yeah, but you're using these terms like cultivate that imply some kind of agency, when in fact all that's happening is that a branch on the evolutionary tree is being generated by evolution, right? That there's a life form that can extract energy from the environment and use it to reproduce. And you're talking about like the DNA cultivating these other forms. No, the replicase gene didn't cultivate the genes for the human brain or anything like that. Those genes evolved because they led to reproduction in the past, and so those genes increased in frequency.
Yeah, this is what I mean by cultivate. It's sort of like a shorthand for all the humans and all the genes that didn't do this are dead, and what we have left is the genes that did manage to accrue stuff around them.
No, because the replicase gene is in every life form, right? Or every DNA-based life form. So it doesn't have to accrue any of these things around it to replicate. It could just replicate, in a very simple life form.
Yeah, but
it's the fact that those other things, like the human body evolved because that was a strategy for reproduction that was successful. Like it didn't evolve just because it helped the replicase gene or something. Like I don't know. I don't even know how to put this into words. I think you're just applying a metaphor that doesn't really apply. Like you can't say that the replicase gene is directing its evolution or accruing these things around it, because what's happening is just a form is evolving because that form as a whole can extract energy from the environment and use it to reproduce as a whole, right? It's not that humans make more copies of the replicase gene. We really don't affect the frequency of the replicase gene in the universe, right? We affect the frequency of the human form. The human form is selected to reproduce the human form. It's not selected to reproduce the replicase gene, because the basis of selection is the ability to reproduce entirely.
I don't know about this. I think we need a new way of coming at this problem. Let me look through my slides. So, is a car something that is evolving? Is a car evolving towards its own reproduction?
Well, a car as an individual thing is not evolving, right? A car is just an object. The information that a car contains, the form of a car, is evolving.
Yeah.
It's evolving in the medium of culture, which means that we have an idea of a car. We use that idea to generate cars. Those cars then go out in the world and they do things. Those things provide a feedback loop, which changes our idea. The selection process here is us looking at how the car works and what it looks like and all that stuff, and then selecting some forms to be, reproduced more and other forms to be reproduced less.
So there's some sort of informational control by the brain over what the car will be like?
Well, there's a causal feedback loop from the instances of the car to the brains, and then to new instances of cars, right? So the form gets copied by us, yes, but in a way that is determined by how the form functions in the world. So you can think about a car as a mimetic replicator. I wouldn't say it's a life form, but the meme replicates. Like, you know, there was some original experimental car, and then people saw that and they liked it and they made more of them, and then it changed over time, and those variations that were better at serving the human functions, the ones that were whatever we wanted, were selected for.
Yeah.
Same thing with domestic animals, right? We've directed their evolution. However, from their perspective, they've directed our evolution, right? It's not like...
Exactly. That's exactly it.
So there's a causal feedback loop between these things, and...
So there's a distinction here between a dog and a car, in that a dog makes other dogs and then gets selected by humans. However, a car does not make other cars. It's humans making cars. Yeah, well, technology is very different from biology because we create it, because it involves our agency, our conscious decisions and subconscious choices, desires, whatever. So the car isn't evolving?
No, the form of cars that evolves, yeah. The meme.
And what is the selfish component in the system of car evolution? Like, what are cars evolving towards?
Well, nothing is evolving towards anything. If that's what you're thinking, that selfishness means we're evolving towards something, that's a mistake. The selfishness is built into the form by evolution. So really all it is that the meme is selfish in the sense that it has been shaped by evolution to appeal to us. And so we'll make more copies of it. So in that sense, it's selfish in that it has evolved to replicate. Replicate through the medium of culture, which depends on human brains, right? So human brains being connected with communication creates a new medium, which is culture. And in that medium, memes can evolve. And that's analogous, but not precisely identical, to the way that biology evolves within the medium of physics. But, there are some distinctions that are kind of important. Like, the way that memes propagate is quite a bit different from the way that life forms propagate. But both evolve in a similar way, which is that there are variations on the forms, and then they are selected, and the ones that are better at propagating become more common, right? Or, they win in this competition for the finite medium that they exist in.
And how does a car be good? Like, how does it be something that promotes its reproduction?
Well, it's the form of the car, right? So it's not necessarily a specific car itself.
Yeah.
But a car that has a certain form, if that form makes people say, hey, I want to have a car like that. They make money for the people who produce them, for example, because there's a demand. So the car, the form of the car generates an economic demand for more copies of the car. And then that increases the frequency of the form in the environment until it reaches some limit, which is just like life forms reach a limit in the environment beyond which there's no profit in making more of them, right? So like if a new organism comes into an ecosystem and it can generate an energy profit in the ecosystem, it will make more copies of itself until that energy profit goes away. And the same thing is true in economics. So really, it's a kind of economic competition when you're talking about technology. And the winners of that economic competition, again, winners in the sense, relative changes in frequency and stuff like that. They win by appealing to people and by being efficient to produce. So you get an evolution toward appealing to people's tastes, desires, whatever, and toward efficient production, right? It's the balance of those two things.
Yeah, so cars will, in some sense, evolve towards being good servants of the human?
I wouldn't say necessarily good servants, because not all technology is necessarily helping us biologically, right? Like a smartphone is probably not hugely beneficial to a human being from a biological perspective. A car might not be either.
Is there any sense that in which something produced by humans could not be servile to humans?
Well, again, when you say servile, this is a metaphor that's very misleading. But there are all sorts of examples that are fairly obvious. Birth control pills, heroin, smartphones, pornography. That appeal to people because they plug into our psychology, but they're not really benefiting us.
Yeah, they're not benefiting the reproduction of the people who do those things. And so, like we talked about in our last conversation, things like birth control probably won't be used in 1,000 years.
Well, I think they probably will be used, but that's a different discussion. Birth control is kind of necessary if you want to maintain civilization. But I guess what will not exist in 1,000 years are people who voluntarily limit their reproduction with birth control, because those people will be selected against. But we might get to a point where we collectively start to control our reproduction, and that's what I've been talking about quite a bit. That ideally, if we want to maintain modern civilization, we have to take over regulating our population and regulating our genome consciously. So if we get to that point, if we still have civilization in 1,000 years, of the type that we have now, or better, it will be because we actually have developed this ability culturally and socially to regulate ourselves. So in that case, we will be forcing people to use birth control. But that's really another topic. I suppose it's kind of related, but.
So, did you say that in the future people will be forcing others to use birth control?
Well, that's the only way we'll have a civilization like we have now. Like, if we don't do that, then civilization is guaranteed to collapse.
But, I mean, all right, so this is aside from the question of what is a replicator, but that's not an evolutionary stable equilibrium situation, is it?
No, it isn't. I mean, if people were voluntarily doing it, it would not be evolutionarily stable, right? And I've made that argument against the idea that we're going to go through a demographic transition. I've pointed out over and over again, that's not an evolutionary equilibrium. Everybody having voluntary low fertility is not an evolutionary equilibrium. But we can solve prisoners' dilemmas and tragedies of the commons with society. This is something I've talked about a lot, though, so I don't want to hijack this discussion with that. If you're interested, I've got several videos on this, and so we can talk about that some other time. But
so, is there a way in which the car can get the genes to? What's a better way of saying that? So, my previous question was: is there any way that the car could not be servile to the humans that make it? And then I don't know how to reiterate this.
Well, I think the key here is, what do you mean by servile?
So, evolving towards the evolutionary interest of the human.
Well, I've already given some examples of things that, don't serve the evolutionary interests of humans that evolve technologically.
Yeah, and we're in an evolving ecosystem right now, and it's going to evolve against things like birth control and against things like bad cars that don't work.
Yes, yeah, sure. I mean, but it's not as simple as because we make it necessarily serves our biological interests. And we had this discussion before about predators and prey, or parasites and hosts. Right, those relationships can go on for a long time in a kind of evolutionary arms race, a kind of red queen race, where the parasite ups its game a little bit, the host ups its game a little bit. And those two things are antagonistic, but that doesn't mean that one wins or that the association doesn't happen, right? So it would be a little bit naive to imagine that memes will serve our interests necessarily, and also mimetic evolution can take place very rapidly. So you can't assume that memes are going to serve our interests, because they can evolve rapidly, just like a cold virus can evolve very rapidly.
Absolutely. So the resolution of a meme is very fine compared to the resolution of a gene. So you can have some mutations in genes that change the way people think about some stuff. But you can't have mutations in genes having extremely fine control over the way people think about stuff. But genes have full access to all of the memes of humans, whereas memes don't have access to causing genes to be any specific way, at least not at the moment.
But genes don't... I sort of understand what you're saying, that the memes have to exist in a brain, and the brain is determined by the genes, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's true. So the medium of culture depends on biology, and that's why I said there is this distinction, and that just like biology sits on the medium of physics or chemistry, memes exist in the medium of culture, and that depends on human brains, and so they cannot really...
Absolutely. So if you imagine a world where humans started splitting atoms at such frequency that there would be no atoms left in the universe, they would eventually get to the point where they wouldn't be able to continue splitting atoms because they're made of atoms. In the same way, a meme can't go around abolishing the genotype that produces that meme, because eventually there'll be insufficient genes to continue sustaining that meme.
Yes, and I totally agree with that, and that's something that I spend a lot of time pointing out to people, that some of their utopian ideas don't work because they're not evolutionarily stable. They don't benefit the genes of the people who carry the memes. But however, that doesn't mean that memes are necessarily our friends biologically, right? They can evolve to be our parasites.
But what happens when they do? What happens if you've got, say, a closed population of people, where some portion of the population of people decide that a suicide cult is a good idea?
Well, that's a very extreme example, right? A suicide cult's a pretty extreme example. But, a meme that is kind of attractive, that kind of plugs into something that, a part of the human brain that's hard to change because it's complex, like our social emotions, and that can mutate, like let's say ideologies. Ideologies are like parasites, but it would be hard for us to biologically evolve a resistance to them, because there can be many different forms, and they're very similar to ideas that are biologically functional. So it would be very hard for us to evolve a resistance to them, And so there are a lot of things like that which will sort of exist with us, like the common cold or whatever, that will never really go away, never really kill us off either.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's really all I'm saying. I agree with you that you can't have a meme that's like radically opposed to human existence and super successful for very long. But you can have memes that are not beneficial, that exist and then sort of mutate, and you get another version of them, and then, just like the common cold, for pretty much forever.
Yeah, so I agree that there's always going to be memes in the universe that are antagonistic to the reproduction of the media that those memes rely on. So there will always be like bad ideas that lead you to make fewer babies. However, oh God, I've lost my train of thought.
Well, it goes back to the servile thing, right? So I think what you're trying to do is argue that therefore memes are servile to us.
Yeah.
But this notion of servility is very, it's a metaphor, and it's very vague. Like, what does it mean? It doesn't mean that they necessarily serve our interests. It just means that they depend on us to exist, right? And that therefore, they cannot replicate at our expense to too great a degree but it doesn't mean that they don't have, or that we can't think of them as having their own, quote unquote, selfish reproductive interests.
Yeah, I agree with this. And so that's the sort of Richard Dawkins level of evolution. And so the Gariepy addendum to this theory is that there is an important question about whether the information in one entity causes the information in the other. So I've got his book open here, and I'd like to read a small entry from it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So it's a sort of heuristic he's got in the book on page 85 to determine which entity between. I didn't read this ahead of time, but in order to determine which entity between memes and genes is the true victim of a trickster printer, one simply has to ask these two questions. Do DNA queens... all right, so I haven't explained this nomenclature, so I'll replace the word queens with genes for now. Do DNA genes have access to modifying the memes of human culture? Answer, yes. DNA can produce different brains that will modify the culture they pass on in various ways. Everything in human culture, from single letters to syllable, to the entire meaning of a sentence, and even the emotional meaning of an entire story, can be modified by a human brain. And number 2, do the memes of human culture have access to modifying DNA genes? Answer, no. At the moment of writing this book, no human culture on Earth has reached a point where it determines the letters of DNA. It determines which letters of DNA are to be modified in a human baby.
Well, can I just explain? That's not true. Lactose tolerance. Culture determined biology. I mean, we've been evolving to fit culture and society for thousands of years.
Now I get to go to page 86, where one point of contention may be raised concerning... Wait, are there legal troubles with reading section excerpts from people's books?
No. It's covered by copyright law. You're fine.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Listeners, go buy his book. It's good. Don't listen to Blithering Genius. So one point of contention may be raised concerning the distinction between printing and selection, a concept upon which our definitions rely. One anonymous member of my YouTube audience, who goes by the pseudonym Fath'am, has expressed this point of contention as follows. The problem with the idea of trickster printers is that the distinction between the act of printing genes and the act of selection is artificial, as both methods can lead to the same result. For instance, I could generate billions of bacteria, each having random alterations in some genes of DNA, until I obtain the set of genes that I'm interested in. In so doing, I would have essentially printed my desired genome without performing an act of printing, merely through selection. So there is a spectrum that you could say exists between printing and selection.
Well, I mean, the whole concept of printing is a misleading metaphor anyway, because it's not. I mean, DNA isn't really printed. I mean, it's a system is replicated. Cellular division is this complex process, and it's not just like a printer printing out DNA.
Yeah.
But hold on. Well, let me just finish one thing though. The error here is trying to prioritize one thing over another. In the case of lactose tolerance, the memes and the genes evolved together. They emerged together. They depend on each other. The genes for lactose tolerance depend on the meme, the cultural meme of drinking milk and, raising cattle and all that stuff. But those memes depend, or at least, are favored by the genes for lactose tolerance. So I think it's just this kind of cognitive error, or maybe it's just the desire to have things be very simple in which there's a single direction of causality, but there's a back and forth. There's no, things emerge together. There's no, there isn't one direction of causality here. And certainly culture and society feeds back into biology all the time. Look at the teeth of a human being. You can't eat any food that hasn't been cooked. the meme of fire, it shaped our form a lot, because without fire, this body cannot live.
So there is a... so you've got a criticism of the concept of a printer. I'm trying to find the definition of printer that he's got.
Well, it's another one of these things where it's like a one-way street kind of idea, right? Like X does Y, as opposed to the whole system reproduces. Like, I don't know what he means by a printer. Yeah, I don't know. Does he mean the phenotype prints the genotype? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I should read out his exact definition rather than... Oh, God, where is it? Sorry, this might take a second. I mean, I could just say what I think a printer is, but I think we'd both be better served by having exact wording. Doop, doop, doop. So you're just going to cut this part, or do you want thinking music?
Whatever, it doesn't matter. I can cut it out later if you want. So take your time. Like, don't worry about it. I can always cut stuff out.
So this is this video that got us this discussion is my first real contribution to YouTube. Is pretty interesting. Like cutting up a video for cutting up just audio really for the first time for
It's hard, isn't it?
Takes ages.
I know. People don't appreciate how hard it is to make audio, especially when you're trying to talk about something complicated, because you fuck it up. You trip over your words, or you screw it up, or you realize, oh shit, I forgot to explain that. And you have to go back, and yeah. And
you've got one concept that's rooted in another concept that you never explained.
It's all circular, yeah.
Oh, for fuck's sake. I wish the PDF had... Well, I wish there was a PDF.
If you want, you could just give your definition, and we can always come back to it later. I mean, we're at an hour, so probably we're not going to cover the full breadth of the book, but we can always do another discussion. So, like, I mean, don't worry about getting everything perfect, right? We can come back, and if you make a mistake, we can do a second run, and you can come back and say, okay, I meant to say blah, 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 right? Like,
yeah. The problem is, I feel like it's right here, and that I'm just missing it. Okay. All right, 10 more seconds, and then I'll just pluck a definition out of my ass. 5, 4, 3, 2. All right, I'm defining the printer now. So a printer is... Well, I actually have a definition in my in the presentation. It's not the exact definition that JF has used, but a printer is an entity that has informational causal access to the composition of some material, where informational causal access is a shorthand for a thing that has a property that directs some other thing to be a certain way based on what the printer is like. So, for instance, a printer might be pyruvate synthase, and it might take a glycolysis product and print it to be 2 pyruvate molecules.
Wait, so now you're defining an enzyme as a printer?
Yeah, absolutely. Everything in the universe is the printer of at least something else in the universe.
Printer then just means causality.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, it's just a thing that does a thing in the universe to something else. So it's a thing that makes another thing.
But you see how that's kind of it's a pretty weird metaphor to use for causality in general, right? I get it because you're thinking it propagates information, but a printer takes information as input and outputs it to another medium, right? That's what it does. And that's not the same as X causes Y, A causes anything else.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what a printer does, actually. So, like, the glycolysis product that gets split is one medium, and then the pyruvate is another medium.
Yeah, but it's, you know what I mean? Like, when you, come on, you have a file on your desktop and you print it to the printer, and the printer takes the information in the file and propagates it with no real loss onto the paper, right? And that's not the same as causality.
Well, there is a kind of loss, because you had the form of the information as a digital media, and then at the end you have a paper media.
Yeah, in that case, sure. I mean, it's a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor for something we do. But I'm just saying that using that as a general purpose metaphor for causality strikes me as yet another misleading metaphor, I guess, because, like an asteroid hits the Earth and prints it, like it prints a crater on the Earth and it prints the death of all the dinosaurs. It's, it's a bit, it's a bit of a stretch, metaphorically. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I don't know. Is there some way that it's an invalid metaphor? Or do you just think that it's not a useful metaphor? Or?
Well, I think it depends on how you're using it, but I mean, I'm thinking that obviously it has connotations of something that, copies information specifically. So, but whatever, let's just go on with that. But that's your definition, so that's fine. We can use that and go forward.
I have forgotten how we got to talking about printers.
Yeah, it was too much of a digression there, because you...
Yeah, I spent ages looking for the damn definition.
Yeah, we were talking about, you were saying...
We were talking about memes, and we were talking about cars and brains, and cars serving brains.
That was a while back.
Oh, no?
Sorry, go ahead. Just go ahead.
Okay, so I'll try and... Well, I think that's what we're talking about, so I'll try and make a rejoinder here. So we're discussing cars being printed by brains, or by the people that build factories that build cars. And so there's not a way that a car can be something... that's what we're talking about. We're talking about... so there's not a way that cars have a way to direct the printing of human genes. However, human genes do have a way of directing the printing of cars.
And that's where the metaphor is misleading, because by your very general notion, and it's just causality, of course cars have a way of, directing the printing, because they have a causal effect on human reproduction. They get your wife to the hospital, so it has a causal effect on it. So if you're so that's where the metaphor becomes misleading, right? When you're using it in two senses. One is a more true to the notion of a printer, and the other is more general.
Yeah, and so then that's where the criticism that I read out from my own words, reprinted in JF's book, about the arbitrary distinction between printing and selection. And so there is a continuum between printing and selection. For instance, you could describe a hawk reprinting the genes of a mouse it catches and eats to be...
Hold on a sec, though. No. By your definition, there's no continuum. Selection is a subset of printing. Unless you want to change the definition. Because printing is just causality.
You're saying that one definition is embedded in the other?
Well, you said that printing is really just anything having an effect on anything else, right? So if that's the case, selection is just a subset of... Because, selection is a kind of causality, right? It's a kind of complex causality.
Okay, I'm happy to say that selection is a kind of printing.
Okay.
Okay, so you could avoid using the word selection and just say that the hawk reprints the genes of the mouse to be some random assortment of disjointed nucleotides because the genome just gets obliterated. Yeah, so you could say that, but it's just less useful. It's the resolution of printing of these genes by the hawk on the mouse is just, it's a complete binary. The hawk has no ability to direct just the genes of pyruvate synthase to be having a single nucleotide mutation. It only has the ability to create a mutation in the entire genome to be not there.
Well, hold on. Nothing has the ability to direct a single nucleotide mutation.
Absolutely. CRISPR does this.
Well, okay, we do. But I mean, in nature, there is nothing that directs a single nucleotide mutation, right?
No, but in principle, you could have this. For instance, Agrobacterium is a bacteria that injects sequences of DNA into plants, and it creates, and in so doing, it creates tumors in the plants, which are great places for the Agrobacterium to grow.
Well, you can have something that has the effect, but now you're talking about something like the Hawk's effect. But there's nothing that goes in. Maybe, setting aside CRISPR, and says, okay, I'm going to switch this base to a different base at this location on a DNA strand. The DNA doesn't do that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's
nothing does that, except we are trying to do that now.
Nothing has been doing that for the last 4 billion years. Absolutely. Nothing has been printing genes with any sort of decent resolution. So Agrobacterium has been printing genes into other organisms with some resolution. However, it doesn't generally do this into reproductive cells. And it does it at the resolution of about 1,000 base pairs rather than one base pair.
Yeah, and viruses have been doing it too in a way. But
yeah.
Okay, I think here's what I think, just from going back to your slides that I skimmed through. I think this is one of the confusions here, that you're using this term to be in control of your evolution or whatever to refer to if a mutation occurs in your DNA, it is selected to reproduce that. I'm not even sure. It's something like that, where it's like the notion of being in control refers to how selection acts on mutations, right? And that to me, when I saw, I wish I had it in front of me, but I'd have to go look for it. That again seems like a really misleading metaphor, because that's not being in control, right? You're not in control of it. It's just that if a mutation happens in your genome, it happens, and if it's selected for, it's selected for.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's control. I would say that the mutations are directed towards some entity, and that entity is whatever self-copying molecule you have in the system, which in this case happens to be DNA replicase. And I say that it's directed towards the self-copying molecule because all of the other information is propagated to the extent that the self-copying molecule is also propagated, because they're all products of it. But then you disagree with that.
Well, again, you can say that about the pyruvate, whatever it was. Is it really synthase? I thought, well, whatever. Yeah, any enzyme you could say that about if it's essential to that on that branch of the tree of life. If that's an essential enzyme, that's true for any of them. So, and the other flip side of that is that any mutation that occurs is only going to be selected for if it increases itself.
Yeah. So that can be true locally in the period of years or hundreds of years. For instance, you could have a religion that exists, and then it copies itself within a context of there being human brains. And the human brains are really fertile media for the copying of this idea. However, as the meme continues to be copied, it will have an impact on the reproduction of the brains that it's passing through. And so if it leads to these brains that it's reliant upon becoming more numerous, then the meme will continue to become more numerous. However, if it's an idea that results in the reduction of the availability of brains to colonize, then the meme will also decline.
But I was thinking of something more like, you know, the altruistic gene that helps other people because, you know, they have replicase gene, or well, let's say a gene that causes you to farm salamanders. Not that such a thing could exist, but, you know, it causes you to farm salamanders, and because you can farm a lot more salamanders than you can create children, that creates more copies of the DNA replicase gene than having children would do. But that can't be selected for because that gene wouldn't copy itself, right? So if the gene doesn't copy itself into the future, it doesn't really matter how many copies of the replicase gene it creates. What matters is, does it get copied into the future itself, right? So the salamander farming gene in this weird hypothetical scenario, it goes extinct because you spend all your time farming salamanders instead of making babies. Right? Now, you made lots of copies of the DNA replicase gene, and then they're all in all of the salamanders, but it doesn't matter because the gene that causes that behavior doesn't replicate itself. So to say that that gene isn't selfish in the sense that it won't be selected to replicate itself is false, right? Every gene has to be good, has to have the effect of replicating itself, not just the replicase gene.
Yeah, every gene, in order to perpetuate and have I want to use the right wording, a line of copying.
Here's a better thought experiment than the salamander thing. Let's imagine a mutation that makes you energetically more efficient, but this mutation has the effect of cutting itself out of the DNA strand before reproduction.
Yeah.
That's not going to evolve, right?
No.
Because it doesn't replicate itself. So
yeah, and you could say the same thing about the meme, in that if a meme is cutting itself out of a line of reproduction by sterilizing the person or making them have half as many babies.
No, this is a different thing. It helps you have more babies. It makes you energetically more efficient. Let's say the gene makes you have 10 kids, makes you allergic to the birth control pill, have 10 kids, and it makes you fertile into your 80s. Okay, so you have like 15, you have 20 kids, whatever. But none of those kids get the gene because the gene removes itself from the DNA strand during meiosis. It has this other effect. Now, obviously, that's a pretty weird thought experiment too, but obviously that's not going to evolve, right? Doesn't matter how much it replicates the replicase gene. If it doesn't replicate, it doesn't evolve.
Yeah. Yeah. So the problem we've got here is that we agree on so much stuff because Richard Dawkins is basically not wrong in his theory of evolution, and I think we both carry that idea of evolution, and the distinction that JF provides is actually so slight compared to that in day-to-day life. Well, not in day-to-day life, but in the things we see in the world currently, because the things that we see in the world currently are the product of 4 billion years of DNA being the genetic media. And so there aren't so many examples of,
Well, do you want to talk about the RNA thing? I mean, we should probably do another one of these because it's obviously we're not covering things fast enough. But I saw something in there about, DNA hijacked RNA or something like that.
Yeah, so rather than going into like a full depth explanation, what happened was there was RNA life on Earth at some point about 4 billion years ago. And in fact, there still is today. It's RNA viruses.
Yeah, the common cold actually is, I think, an RNA virus.
Oh, congratulations, RNA.
That's why it mutates so fast because because RNA is very unstable, right? So I think that's true. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's true.
Yeah, I think that's the case as well. So at some point in the past, there was RNA-based life, and there wasn't DNA-based life. And then some RNA-based life began producing DNA, and it began producing DNA as a machine similar to the proteins it would also be producing at that time. And this DNA molecule made the RNA-based life more fit in the same way that the proteins it produced made the RNA-based life more fit. And then this DNA molecule began to the RNA-based life then began dumping copies of its genes into DNA for whatever reason, and it became. I'm bad at giving complete stories of these things.
Well, I think you're going to say something like it became servile to the DNA because now the DNA is, in control or something like that. Isn't that the gist of it?
Yeah. Sorry, can I? I'll be back in 30 seconds. I just get a drink of water.
Yeah, no worries. I was gonna fill the space by talking about my my theory about the origin of life, that it's not RNA initially and then DNA, but metabolism, then possibly RNA out of ATP, and then probably DNA later. But you can't really have any complex life without DNA, I don't think.
Yeah, that may be the case because RNA accumulates mutations too quickly. And so if you compare the rate of mutation to the quantity of RNA, you'll eventually get to the point where there's no fidelity amongst the copying of the RNA. And you just can't accumulate a large enough density of information to control the universe around the molecule well enough.
Yeah, it's a very unstable molecule, right? DNA is very stable because of that double helix structure. It's a good storage medium, right? So it's like the hard drive. RNA is kind of like working memory that you can copy information into, and you can move it around. But it doesn't last very long. Like you say, it's not. I guess it's fairly high fidelity, but it degrades rapidly because it's just very unstable. But it does have that interesting property that it folds like a protein a little bit, so it can be an enzyme too, right? So it is that sort of intermediate thing between a pure information storage medium and the proteins that actually do, the real heavy lifting, the actual work in a cell.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think? Well, I was just saying, what do you think about this idea? I'm just going to throw an idea out there at you. A bit off topic, but what the heck? You know how RNA and DNA, they have that, they're sugars, right? So it's basically just, it's a sugar phosphate chain, but the bases are nitrogen based molecules, right? Like proteins. And, proteins have nitrogen in them. They're not all nitrogen. They're not like nitrogen entirely. But I was thinking that the quantum properties of nitrogen are what make life interesting, because it has a kind of irregular valence shell. Carbon is regular. It has those four electrons in its outer shell and then 4 spaces, right? But that means it might be kind of a boring molecule. Like most of the molecules that are just purely carbon chains are not that interesting. And then you get nitrogen, you get all these weird shapes, right? Like proteins fold into those weird shapes that have the electrical properties that make them do all the things they do.
You've got to read this book, dude, because he's talking about all the things that you're talking about and providing. Yeah. So I give a brief explanation of one of the things that he's doing in the book, which is providing a sort of alternate way of a modified way of doing phylogeny, to include reference to ancestors of life forms that don't share a genetic media. And so this wasn't actually in the book. This was in a previous version of the book that he's changed for the final publication. but he's got a line of descent, which has just got some example life forms, beetles, lions, and humans, and showing a branching tree of phylogeny between these life forms in hard lines, and then a dashed line to the branch between RNA viruses and all of the DNA, and saying that this is a kind of ancestry between DNA and RNA. And in that same chapter, he's going on to speculate that, in fact, to propose that proteins were a genetic media prior to RNA being a genetic media, in the same way that RNA was prior to DNA.
Yeah, I think that probably metabolic cycles with proteins predated DNA and RNA life, yeah. It seems plausible anyway.
Yeah, and then he's going on to speculate perhaps that that quantum Darwinism is true, and that the existence of the protein replicators is predicated on there being some kind of quantum or atomic or some level of replicator prior to the protein replicator.
Well, I don't know if I would agree with that, but I mean, I was just thinking that it's the weirdness of nitrogen, or nitrogen gives it gives life the complexity necessary to form like complex systems, and I don't think carbon alone does that. Just because, all the interesting things have nitrogen in them, right? Like proteins and nucleotides and stuff like that. And I think that's probably because of that 3-5 valence structure that means you get all kinds of different shapes. But that's I don't know. I'm just going off on a tangent. So
you could be onto something very interesting there.
Anyway, I'll terminate that tangent now, and we'll get back to the topic. So where were we when you left?
I was giving a recounting of the events that precipitated DNA as a replicator. So we had a state of affairs in the world where RNA was a life form and it was replicating, and then it started producing DNA as a machine, much like the proteins that it was producing at the time, and it eventually started dumping copies of its genes into DNA. So there was some information coming from the RNA molecule and then being copied into an equivalent copy, except it was made out of DNA. And it found that to be useful for whatever reason, whether it was storing backup copies of RNA genes in DNA that had greater fidelity, not fidelity, but that didn't degrade as quickly, and so it could be used as a reference point for future, like copying RNA genes in the future. Or perhaps in the environment of there being lots of RNA molecules, creating a DNA molecule might have been a sort of sneaky way to go undetected by the mechanisms of other life forms. And so DNA may have originated in viruses that were sort of disguising themselves for the infiltration of cells. But in any case, there were copies of RNA genes made of DNA. And then RNA began using DNA as a reference point for recopying back RNA genes so that it could do things with them. And this also provided a fitness to the RNA-based life. And so this system of RNA printing sequences of DNA that were copies of the RNA, and then DNA being used to print copies of the RNA, it was a fit system. It was good for the RNA molecule, and it was good for the DNA molecule that was gradually acquiring its own evolutionary selfishness.
But let's just pause for a second, because it wasn't good for the molecule, right? I mean, the molecule is just a molecule that the molecule doesn't replicate. Like, the information in the molecule replicates, right? So it's the information that's encoded in a sequence of base pairs that is replicated from RNA to DNA or back or whatever, and into another life form through reproduction. So it's really the information that, that gets replicated and that has a sort of interest, or fitness or whatever. The molecule doesn't, because the molecule is just, a bunch of atoms, and it's going to degrade no matter what, right?
But you're not going to describe the information as being anything other than material.
Well, no, I am, because the information has to be stored in a medium, but the information is not the same as what it's stored in. And it certainly isn't the molecule. Because if it was the molecule, well, then it never gets copied. That molecule doesn't, literally get copied or transported or whatever. It's just the information in it gets copied. A new molecule is created. The old molecule eventually is destroyed, right?
Absolutely. The original molecule gets destroyed, and then during its existence, it creates this phenotypic machine, which is a copy of its genome. And so future copies of the genome are the phenotype of the original genome. And then, like we can see that is actually the case. But then, because we're biologists and we're lazy and we don't want to say it produced a phenotype, which was then the genotype every time, we just say that the genotype was copied.
Yeah, but I mean, the reason why it becomes a little bit important is because you're saying it's not something like it wasn't good for the molecule, or the molecule. I can't remember exactly what you said.
Yeah, I used the word good, yeah.
It's just important to remember that it's really the information, the molecule. No molecule that existed 4 billion years ago exists today, but some of the information that exists, maybe not 4 billion, 3.5 billion, whatever, years ago, still exists in me and you and bacteria and so on, right? Like maybe, I don't know, like the replicase gene, right? That's information. It's not a molecule. It's the information that persists. It's not a molecule that persists. And I just think that's an important thing to keep in mind. I just wanted to throw that in there.
I'm happy to start calling this information, but I don't see a distinction between molecules and these molecules being in a certain sequence and these molecules being a certain way and not some other molecule as being anything like that. That is understanding that is the information, I guess. So,
well, if you're talking about what is good for a molecule, you're using a metaphor that's pretty... Like, even to say what's good for information is a bit iffy, but at least because information can propagate and it can be selected to propagate, you can say it's good for it in the sense that it enables it to propagate or something.
Okay, I'm happy to say that this is information that is written in a certain media. So you could have AUG is information written in RNA, and then ATG is information written in a DNA media.
Right, and where this is kind of relevant is if you're saying like DNA is tricking RNA or RNA is tricking DNA, well, really, they're just two molecules that can hold the same information.
So they're not tricking each other yet. So the RNA and the DNA in this system I've described, where the information in the RNA gets copied into the DNA, and then the information in the DNA gets copied into the RNA, there's no distinction in the interests of these media yet. And the reason for this is that if there's a mutation in the RNA that's bad for... But
how can there be a difference in the interests of the media when they're just molecules that will both be destroyed anyway?
Okay, all right. So the information contained within the media, then.
Right, but it's the same information in both. So
exactly.
How can there be an antagonism? Okay, well, keep going then.
Exactly. Yeah. There's no distinction between the evolutionary selfish interest of the information contained within either media, because they copy each other. there's no there's no interest in sabotaging the composition of the genome of the other media, because that will end up sabotaging the copy of, like, your copy of that same gene. So there's a intertwined evolutionary interest for both of these media. And then, as it turned out, the better thing to do for this tango life form of DNA and RNA together was to entrust the copying process to DNA over RNA. And we can speculate about all sorts of reasons why this might have been the case, and potential circumstances where this might not be the case, like in a virus like the cold that benefits from low fidelity. But
well, I think we can just say that the DNA allows for a more stable storage medium for the information, and that's why it was selected for.
Yeah, that's probably, or I would maybe go as far as saying almost certainly one of the major reasons, but we're not going to know the reason because it happened 4 billion years ago. But yeah, that's probably the case. And so DNA was the favored media, and eventually RNA had such an interest in allowing the composition of the DNA media to direct the composition of the RNA media that the RNA media lost all self-copying capacity.
Okay, so this is where you're tricking yourself with metaphors, right? Because the information that's in the DNA or RNA isn't specific to one or the other medium, and it isn't the same as the medium. It's not like the RNA lost something or whatever. It's just that the information that got stored in DNA and that information propagated better, and then it mutated, and those mutations were, propagated through the medium of the DNA. But it's not like DNA won and RNA lost, because those are just two types of molecules. They're just two ways of storing information. It's the information that's selected. It's not the molecule, right? It's not deoxyribonucleic acid or ribonucleic acid that gets selected. It's a sequence of base pairs that can be represented, that can be manifest in DNA, RNA, proteins, or in the entire phenotype. You can think about it in different ways. So I think you're confusing yourself with that metaphor. That's exactly where I think that when I skimmed through it, I saw that and I thought, this is the big mistake.
So the difference that has been created by DNA continuing to do self-copying and RNA ceasing to do self-copying is that mutations...
Remember, they're not copying themselves, they're copying information.
Oh, okay, all right. Let's change the words. So the important difference between the information in DNA media that continues to do self-copying and the information in RNA media that no longer continues to do self-copying is that mutations within the information stored in the RNA will not be reproduced over multiple generations in the same way that mutations in a table that I cause by chopping it with an axe are not reproduced in future copies of that table that I create. Or future copies of the information stored in the table that
I understand the concept, but I think this is a very weird way of thinking about things, that because a mutation occurs in the DNA and not in the RNA, and it's only the mutations that occur in DNA that get selected and propagated, therefore the DNA wins, or the DNA is in control, because the DNA isn't in control of mutations and it's not in control of selection. So it's just the medium, the storage medium.
Yeah, it's in control of printing.
It's not in control of anything. Well, they're both in control of printing, both the RNA and DNA and the proteins and the whole thing, and the cell and the lipid layer, all that stuff is sort of in control of it. But
it doesn't have resolution of printing. So
no, but the DNA doesn't change its own base pairs. It's just what you're talking about is a mutation that occurs, that happens, when a UV ray hits a water molecule or something and ionizes it, and then it bumps into the DNA at a critical point and somehow fucks it up. I don't know. that's not being in control. That's a mutation. It's a random occurrence.
So the sun has complete access to causing mutations in a genome of, for instance, humans. A sun could potentially fire a photon and hit any molecule of DNA anywhere that's not under like 10 meters of rock or whatever. But the thing about the sun is that it doesn't have resolution on which base this occurs to. So the sun doesn't direct the sequences of DNA to mutate in a way that
No, it's only selection that directs which sequences are going to become more common or less common. It's not the mutation. Mutation is essentially random, right? That's the point of it. There's random variation and then there's selection. But there's no, like, little demon homunculus DNA print, like saying, oh, I think I'll change this base pair. I mean, like, that's where it just struck me as, what the hell does this mean? In control? Meaning that what? If a mutation occurs to me and it's selected for, that means I'm in control? Do you see what I mean? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so I don't know if I use the word control, but I use the phrase informational causal access.
You're saying the RNA is no longer in control of its evolution. But the DNA is in control of its evolution, I guess. But do you see what I mean?
No, that it's subject to evolution.
Well, yeah, the information in the DNA is subject to evolution.
Yeah.
You could never get beyond a certain point with RNA anyway, right? You're never going to get to a complex life form with RNA anyways.
But outside of RNA viruses, RNA is not subject to evolution.
Well, it's not the RNA. I mean, again, RNA is sort of subject to evolution in the sense that, let's say there was a better molecule to do the job. I mean, it could be selected for, but, it's probably not since it's been like 4 billion years or so. Or maybe, I don't know if it's been 4 billion, but it's been a long time, right? But it's the information that evolves. It's not RNA that evolves. It's not DNA that evolves.
Yeah, it's the information stored in this media.
Stored in DNA, and DNA is a medium that can store more information. So, of course, you're going to get more evolution in that medium, and you're going to get more complex life forms in that medium. But so what? I mean, calling that being in control just seems like a very strange use of that.
No, I don't say that this stuff is in control. Like, I don't say that there's agency amongst the molecules.
Well, I know you're not saying there's agency, but I think you said like DNA or RNA lost control of its evolution and thus its ability to be selfish. Something like that.
Yeah, okay. So let me explain what it means to lose control over your evolution. When I say that, I mean that the molecule is no longer evolving. It's no longer selfishly evolving.
A better way of saying that is the molecule is no longer the primary storage medium for the information that is selfishly evolving.
Yeah, that's another way of saying it, yeah, that it isn't a genetic media anymore, the RNA.
Right. Now that I agree with, right.
Yeah.
But the RNA was never, it was never evolving as RNA. It was the information that was in it, like that, in that RNA-based life form that was evolving. That was that's what was being selected for or against. That was what was mutating.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It wasn't like RNA was evolving into, I don't know, acetyl salicylic acid or something, right? Like, you see what I mean? There's a confusion between a type of a molecule, which is RNA, and the information that it contains, which is what is actually evolving. And at the time when RNA life became DNA life, whatever information was in the RNA got stuck into the DNA and then continued to evolve. Some of that information was probably there before RNA in metabolic cycles and protein and, basically protein carbohydrate cycles or something like that, which then some of that got into RNA and then some of that got into DNA. But over time, like if you go back 4 billion years and go to now, most of the information we have now came from the sun or from random events, right?
You could. So I kind of like this way of describing it. You could describe there as being a chain of informational causal access that has crossed genetic media. The statement I make is that if we just ignore the existence of RNA viruses for the sake of this statement, that RNA was a genetic media at some point, and it's no longer a genetic. That was stupid. That was dumb.
What?
I've just made the conversation circular again for absolutely no reason.
Well, no, I mean, it's fine. We agree on that, right? That it was a genetic medium, probably at some very distant point in the in the history of life, and the genetic medium became DNA, and that led to an explosion of complexity, probably.
Yeah.
And so most of the information in our genomes didn't exist in that RNA genome because it couldn't. And I don't know if the common cold virus is probably some new thing where RNA hopped out of a eukaryotic cell and became a independent life form or something like that. But I don't know. I'm just guessing.
Yeah. So there is a line of thought amongst scientists that they suppose that the RNA and DNA viruses split from more complex life forms at some point.
I am just guessing because it seems like that would be more probable than it's some kind of holdover that happened to evolve the ability to, plug into our cells. I mean, there might still be ancient RNA life hiding in some crack in the earth somewhere. It's possible. We'd have a hard time finding it if there was. But whatever information, probably, I mean, information is really created by selection. I mean, it starts out as random mutation, right? But it's really selection that makes it into, meaningful information, right? Without selection, it's just randomness, just noise.
So, yeah, that's sort of tying all the way back to the beginning of the conversation where selection is required to make some accumulated information in a replicator meaningful, but you also need memory for that information so that I'm losing it.
It's all right. Well,
so the information needs to be stored in a media so that it can have memory and accumulate behaviors that contribute to that fitness. And then so that's the Richard Dawkins definition, that Richard Dawkins doesn't use these words, but a replicator needs memory and it needs fitness.
Yeah, it needs memory and it needs energy is another way of saying it. It needs energy to reproduce because it has to do work to move around molecules.
Yeah, and it needs to. I would describe that as the thing needs to exist, but I'm happy to describe it as the thing needs to have energy.
Not only to exist, but to do what you call printing or to replicate a molecule takes energy because you're ordering, you're creating order out of chaos. That's what life forms do. They extract energy from the environment first and foremost. Then they use that energy to reproduce. But so that's the basic gist of life. But what I'm saying, and I'm not trying to be really antagonistic or anything. Maybe I'm coming across as being a little bit, of a jerk. I apologize if I am. But I just don't see any new ideas here. I don't see any great breakthrough. I think these metaphors are just confusing. The DNA isn't in control. It's just a molecule that contains the information that is being selected and evolving, and then that's all it is. And it's not tricking the RNA. That's just a terrible metaphor. It's just that the RNA and DNA are part of an information system. They're part of life forms that they replicate as systems, and they're holistic, right? The fact that the RNA is not the genetic medium now, not the medium of storage for the information of life, it's interesting. It's an important fact. There are reasons for it, like the stability of DNA. But to describe it as like DNA tricking RNA or taking over from it or something, it doesn't make any sense to me.
So it takes over it is the medium in which the information is being selected.
Sure.
Yeah. So like taking over and control is not. If I'm using those words, it's not in a way with that these. There's no agency amongst DNA. To be in control of evolution is to be in control of nothing. It's just to mean that it's the molecule that is being selected for fitness in the environment.
But it's not the molecule that's being selected for fitness. It's the information, and it's the way that information is manifested in other things, like the entire phenotype. It's really the phenotype that is selected to be able to replicate the information of the phenotype. And by the way, there are a lot of things that replicate that are not replicated through DNA. Well, maybe not a lot of things, but there are some things that replicate not through the medium of DNA. I mean, there are some really interesting examples, like you can reverse part of the cell wall or the cell membrane of certain organisms, and that reversal will replicate. So not everything is in DNA, and without the package, like without cytoplasm, DNA is just junk, right? It doesn't do anything.
Yeah, because it doesn't have memory. So the cytoplasm has no record of the way it should be, and so it won't be able to like maintain that into the future.
Well, I mean, you need both, right? It's like the DNA is kind of like, it contains the information about all the proteins needed and blah, blah, blah. But you need the proteins to read I hate using these terms, but, to synthesize the RNA and to do the transcription and the translation and blah, blah, blah. You need all the proteins there to do the whole thing and make it work. And you need the energy metabolism of the cell to drive all those processes. And you need the cell membrane to hold it all together. And it's the system, it's the information. The information is in the system, and it's the information of the system that replicates. It's not, the system doesn't exist to replicate deoxyribonucleic acid. Its function, its evolved function, is to replicate the specific information of the system, which includes the information in the specific sequence of nucleotides in the DNA, but also other information as well. Do you see my point? Like, I'm sorry, I think this is just not what it's claimed to be. I don't think it's any kind of revolutionary breakthrough. I think it's just a bunch of confusing metaphors slapped onto evolutionary theory that are wrong, that are misleading. Like, I don't get it. Maybe I'm just missing something, but I don't get it.
So maybe we can come back to this another time, and I can give a more ordered argument for what I'm arguing for, because we've really just come back to the I think maybe an unclear definition that I've provided.
Yeah, okay, we can pick it up later. It is getting on 2 hours, so that's probably reaching the limits of any kind of intelligent conversation. I enjoyed it. This was fun. I mean, I do like talking about these things, and I apologize if I was a little bit
so harsh. Canadian.
Yeah, I have to be a Canadian here. I just have to say this, though. I am not impressed by JF, really. Yeah. I know you are. Yeah. You're a big fan. I don't find him very interesting. Maybe I'm missing something, but...
Yeah. So I spent about a year trying to disprove what he was saying. And I came at him a number of times with different arguments. And I basically just found myself in the position where I couldn't disprove any of it, and it seemed to explain evolution and evolutionary selfishness better than any other theory that I could come up with.
So is your background biochemistry?
Molecular biology.
Molecular biology, okay. That's an interesting subject. Are those parakeets or what are they called?
Oh, let me check. Oh, these are lorikeets. We've got a number of bird families that live in the backyard at this point.
Nice. I'd like to visit there. It sounds really nice.
Yeah, there's not much to do in Australia. You can look at the scenery and you can relax and you can drink beer. And
that sounds great.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. All right. If we do this again, I'd like to order my ideas a bit better.
Yeah, that's fine. I would suggest that. Like, I think second round would be fine. I mean, I enjoy this conversation. I don't honestly I don't know how many other people in the world would want to listen to this, but I
think JF will want to listen.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, you can point him to it. I mean, I'm interested in his feedback.
Yeah, I think he'll be disappointed in me, to be honest.
I don't know. I think you did a good job of presenting the ideas. I don't think you should blame yourself. I think the ideas are wrong, okay? I'm just going to say it. I don't think you're presenting them badly. I think the error is in the ideas. But yeah, what I would suggest is write something up, maybe. The slideshow was good, but it was kind of long, and maybe focus on the very key issues here, like the definition of evolutionary selfishness that you're talking about. I guess this notion of printing and whatever you want to do. But I think, yeah, writing it up and then we can go through it again. I'm fine with that. All right, so yeah, we'll talk again.
Awesome. I'll see you later.
All right, bye-bye.